Emma stood beside him, her face pale, her hands trembling. She had loved those dogs. They had been her companions for so long, a source of comfort and joy. Now they were a threat, and the thought of what they had become cut through her like a blade. "John," she whispered, her voice breaking, "are we really going to do this?" John didn't look at her. His gaze remained fixed on the dogs, who were now growling low, their eyes glinting with madness. He could feel the weight of the decision in his chest, a crushing pressure that made it hard to breathe. Chapter 1. Calm days before the storm. The morning sun cast golden light over the small farm, warming the earth and filling the air with the sounds of waking animals. Emma stood in the yard, dressed in her usual apron and sturdy boots, carrying a heavy bucket of grain. She moved with the practiced grace of someone who had spent decades tending to animals, her hands steady despite their age. She opened the wooden gate to the chicken coop, and immediately, a flurry of feathers erupted as the hens rushed toward her, clucking and flapping in excitement. "All right, ladies, calm down," she chuckled, scattering the feed across the ground. The geese, always louder and more demanding, honked impatiently from the other side of the yard. Nearby, John was working on the fence, his weathered hands tightening a loose post with careful precision. He paused to wipe the sweat from his brow, watching Emma with a soft smile. It was a quiet, simple life, but one they had built together with love and patience. After feeding the chickens, Emma turned her attention to the pigs, who grunted in anticipation as she poured their food into the trough. One particularly greedy piglet pushed its siblings aside, diving headfirst into the meal. "Greedy little thing," Emma muttered affectionately, patting its back. The morning was filled with these small, comforting tasks, the kind of work that felt rewarding in its simplicity. The cows, Bessie and Betty, stood lazily in the pasture, their tails swishing away flies. The rabbits hopped in their enclosure, their noses twitching as Emma refilled their water. Everything was as it should be, an ordinary day with unusual signs. As the day stretched on, the farm bustled with its usual rhythm. John finished his work on the fence and joined Emma by the porch, where she had prepared a pot of tea. They sat together, watching the animals go about their business. But something felt off. The dogs, Duke and Rusty, were behaving strangely. Normally, they would be lying in the sun or trotting happily around the farm. But today they were restless, pacing near the barn and growling at seemingly nothing. "Have you noticed them acting weird?" Emma asked, sipping her tea. John nodded, rubbing his chin. "Yeah, maybe they caught the scent of a fox or something." Emma frowned, glancing at the darkening horizon. The wind had begun to pick up, rustling the leaves in the trees. The sky, once clear and bright, now held a heavy, grayish hue. "I don't like the look of that," she murmured. John followed her gaze. "Storm's coming," he said matter-of-factly. "We should check the barn, make sure everything's secure." The first signs of the storm. As the afternoon wore on, the wind grew stronger, whipping through the farm with an eerie persistence. The geese, normally fearless, huddled together in a corner of their pen. The cows stomped their hooves uneasily, flicking their ears as if sensing something unnatural in the air. By evening, the clouds had thickened, swirling into an ominous mass overhead. The air smelled of rain, thick and electric. Emma hurried to bring in the last of the washing from the line while John locked up the barn. Then, the first crack of thunder rumbled in the distance. Emma flinched, glancing toward the sky. "That one sounded close," she muttered. John nodded grimly. "We'd better get inside." But just as they turned toward the house, Duke let out a long, low growl. Rusty followed suit, his fur bristling. They stood at the edge of the yard, staring toward the far side of the field. Emma's heart pounded. "What is it, boy?" she called, stepping closer. Duke suddenly barked, sharp, urgent. A second later, the wind howled, and the first drops of rain splattered against the ground. The storm breaks. Night fell quickly, and with it came the full fury of the storm. The wind roared like a living beast, shaking the house and rattling the windows. Rain pounded against the roof, drowning out nearly every other sound. Emma and John sat by the fireplace, listening anxiously. The lantern flickered, casting long shadows against the wooden walls. Outside, the animals were restless. The geese honked in distress. The cows let out uneasy moos. The dogs, locked safely inside, whined and scratched at the door. Then, crack! A deafening snap echoed through the storm, followed by an earth-shaking crash. Emma jumped to her feet. That sounded like a tree. John grabbed his raincoat and flashlight. Stay here. I'll check. But Emma was already pulling on her boots. I'm coming with you. They stepped out into the storm, the wind nearly knocking them back. The flashlight's beam cut through the rain, illuminating the chaos. And then they saw it. 2 massive trees had fallen, one of them crushing part of the barn. And beneath the wreckage, barely visible through the tangled branches, a low, desperate moan. Emma's breath caught in her throat. John, that's Betty. John's jaw tightened. She's trapped. The storm howled around them, but there was no time to hesitate. They had to save her. Chapter 2. A devastated morning. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world of destruction. The once peaceful farm now looked as though it had been caught in the grip of some furious giant. Broken branches littered the ground, puddles of muddy water reflected the gray morning sky, and the air was thick with the scent of wet earth and splintered wood. Emma stood in the doorway of their house, clutching her shawl tightly around her shoulders. The morning light revealed the full extent of the damage. One of the large oak trees near the barn had been completely uprooted, its massive trunk lying across the roof of the structure. Another tree had fallen near the pasture fence, its branches tangled in the wire. John, already up and moving, trudged through the soaked grass toward the barn, his boots sinking into the mud with each step. He had feared damage, but seeing the destruction with his own eyes sent a wave of exhaustion through his body. Emma followed closely behind, her face tight with worry. The animals, she murmured. We have to check on them. Missing Betty. Together they approached the barn. The doors were still intact, though slightly ajar from the force of the wind. Inside, the geese and chickens clucked and squawked nervously, their feathers ruffled. The rabbits, huddled together in a corner of their enclosure, twitched their noses in distress. John quickly checked the pigs, finding them unharmed but restless. The cows, Bessie stood near the back, her large eyes filled with confusion. But Betty, Emma's stomach dropped. Where's Betty? John scanned the barn, his heart pounding. The other animals were accounted for, but there was no sign of their second cow. A terrible thought crept into his mind. He turned sharply, his gaze moving toward the wreckage outside. The trees, he muttered. Emma's breath hitched. Oh, John! Without another word, they rushed toward the fallen oak. A desperate cry. The ground was slick with mud as they reached the massive tree trunk. Branches sprawled in all directions like the limbs of a fallen beast, and somewhere beneath the twisted wreckage, a faint, muffled sound reached their ears. A low, strained moan. Emma clasped a hand over her mouth. Betty! John immediately dropped to his knees, pushing aside smaller branches in a frantic search. He followed the sound, his hands trembling as he cleared away debris. And then, beneath the thickest branches, he saw her. Betty was lying on her side, pinned beneath the heavy limbs. Her breathing was labored, her sides rising and falling unevenly. Her usually calm, dark eyes were wide with fear. Emma knelt beside her, running a soothing hand along Betty's neck. We're here, girl. We'll get you out. But John could already tell the branches were too heavy. He tried lifting one, his muscles straining, but it barely moved. Damn it, he muttered. I need an axe? Or a saw? Something to cut through this. Emma looked toward the sky. The clouds were thick and heavy, and a fine mist of rain had already begun to fall. We don't have much time, she whispered. John clenched his jaw. The storm had tested them once, but this was a fight against time. Betty's life depended on them, and they weren't going to let her down. Chapter 3. The Fight for Betty's Life. The rain was falling steadily now, soaking into John's clothes as he ran toward the tool shed. His boots slipped in the mud, but he barely noticed. His mind was focused on one thing: freeing Betty before it was too late. Inside the shed, he grabbed the heaviest axe he owned, its wooden handle worn smooth from years of use. He knew the fallen oak was thick, but he had no other choice. He had to try. When he returned to the site, Emma was still kneeling beside Betty, whispering soft reassurances as she gently stroked the cow's neck. Betty's breathing was shallow, her sides rising and falling in uneven jerks. The poor animal was exhausted, her strength fading with each passing moment. John gritted his teeth and positioned himself beside the thickest branch pinning Betty down. He raised the axe over his head and brought it down with all his strength. Crack! The blade bit into the wood, but barely made a dent. Desperate attempts. John swung again and again. Each blow sent splinters flying, but the branch was too thick, too heavy. His arms burned, his breath came in ragged gasps. Emma stood abruptly. "Wait!" She turned and ran toward the barn. John paused for a moment, watching as she disappeared inside, and then went back to hacking at the wood. But his strikes were getting weaker. He could feel it, this wasn't working. Moments later, Emma returned, carrying a bundle of sturdy ropes. "If we can't cut it, maybe we can pull it off," she said breathlessly. John wiped sweat and rain from his brow. "It's worth a shot." They worked quickly, securing the ropes around the heaviest limb. John wrapped the other end around a sturdy fence post, then grabbed hold with both hands. Emma braced herself beside him. "On three," John said. "1, 2, 3. They pulled with everything they had. Muscles strained, feet dug into the wet ground, but the branch barely budged. Betty let out a weak, pitiful moan. John's stomach twisted. They were running out of time. The ominous howl. Just as they were about to try again, a sound cut through the steady patter of rain. A long, chilling howl. Emma stiffened. "The dogs," she whispered. John turned his head toward the barn, where Duke and Rusty were locked up. But the sound hadn't come from them. It had come from somewhere further away, deeper in the woods. Then another howl, closer this time, and something about it sent a shiver down John's spine. "They don't sound right," Emma murmured. John didn't answer. He could hear it in the way the howls rose and fell, in the strange, frenzied urgency behind them. Something was wrong, but there was no time to worry about that now. Call for help. John turned back to Betty, his mind racing. They weren't strong enough to lift the tree alone. The axe wasn't working. The ropes weren't enough. They needed help. He exhaled sharply and looked at Emma. "I'm going to get Jack." Emma nodded, her expression tight. "Hurry." John didn't waste another second. He turned and sprinted toward the neighbor's house, his heart pounding against his ribs. Behind him, Betty let out another weak moan, and somewhere in the distance, the dogs howled again. Chapter 4. Danger draws closer. John ran as fast as his legs could carry him, his boots slipping on the wet ground as he made his way toward Jack's farmhouse. The rain had slowed to a steady drizzle, but the air was thick with moisture, clinging to his skin and making every breath feel heavy. The distant howls still echoed through the woods, an eerie, unnatural sound that made his stomach twist. By the time he reached Jack's house, he was breathless. He pounded on the door, his knuckles sore from the impact. It took only seconds before Jack appeared, his face tense with concern. The older man's grizzled beard was damp from sweat and rain, and his sharp blue eyes quickly took in John's state. "John," he said, "what the hell's going on?" "It's Betty," John panted. "A tree fell on her. She's pinned, Emma, and I can't lift it. We need your help." Jack didn't hesitate. He grabbed his raincoat and a heavy-duty winch from his tool shed, slinging the thick metal cables over his shoulder. "Come on," he said. "Let's get your girl out." The struggle to lift the tree. By the time they returned to the fallen oak, Emma was still kneeling beside Betty, stroking the cow's side as she whispered soothing words. Betty's breathing had become even shallower, her strength waning. Jack took one look at the situation and nodded toward the winch. "We hooked this up to the biggest branch, use the truck to pull it off," he said. "It should work. If the damn thing doesn't give us trouble, John grabbed one end of the cable and secured it tightly around the thickest part of the branch. Jack moved toward his truck, fastening the other end to the rear hitch. The plan was simple. Use the truck's power to slowly lift and shift the tree just enough for them to drag Betty out. Jack climbed into the driver's seat and turned the key. The engine roared to life, a comforting, steady sound against the uneasy quiet of the farm. "All right," Jack called through the open window. "Here goes nothing." The truck rolled forward, the cable tightening with a sharp metallic twang. The branch groaned as it began to shift, the pressure slowly easing from Betty's trapped body. For the first time since the storm, John felt a flicker of hope. And then, the winch jammed. A horrible grinding noise filled the air as the mechanism locked up, refusing to budge. The branch teetered but remained stubbornly in place. "Damn it!" Jack cursed, throwing the truck into reverse and trying again. But the cable refused to move, the winch stuck. John clenched his fists. "We don't have time for this," he muttered. He rushed to the jammed mechanism, trying to loosen it by hand. Jack jumped out of the truck, hurrying to help. And that was when they heard it, the snarl from the shadows, a low guttural growl. John froze, his blood running cold. From the barn, Duke and Rusty stood at the edge of the yard, their bodies tense, their ears pinned back, their lips curled over their teeth, saliva dripping from their jaws. Their eyes, normally filled with intelligence and warmth, were wild, unfocused, almost empty. "Duke," Emma called softly. "Rusty, what's wrong?" The dogs didn't move. Their muscles were rigid, their hackles raised. Then, as if some unseen force commanded them, they took a step forward. Then another. The growling deepened, turning into something raw and feral. Jack shifted beside John, his voice low. "Those dogs ain't right." John barely had time to respond before Duke lunged. A close call. The world seemed to slow. Duke launched himself straight at John, jaws snapping just inches from his face. Instinct took over. John threw himself backward, hitting the mud hard as the dog's teeth clamped down on empty air. "Jesus!" Jack shouted, stepping between them. Duke landed, turned, and snarled. His entire body coiled like a spring. Rusty, as if following his lead, lowered his head and let out a chilling snarl of his own. Emma took a step forward, her hands raised in a calming gesture. "Easy, boys. It's us. It's okay." But it wasn't okay. Duke's eyes were empty of recognition. Rusty was trembling, his breathing erratic. They weren't acting out of fear or even anger. They were sick. John's mind raced. Rabies. It had to be. The erratic behavior, the aggression, the blank, glazed-over eyes. It all made sense now. "Emma, stay back," he shouted. But it was too late. Rusty leaped. Emma barely had time to react before his teeth sank into her arm. The bite. Emma gasped in pain, stumbling backward as Rusty's jaws locked onto her forearm. Blood blossomed instantly, bright and red against the pale skin. John saw red. "Rusty, he roared, lunging forward. He grabbed the dog by the scruff of the neck, yanking him away with all his strength. Rusty let go, his jaws snapping shut just as John threw him aside. The dog hit the ground and scrambled up instantly, growling, but hesitated, for just a moment. Jack moved fast, grabbing a wooden plank from the wreckage and swinging it between them and the dogs. "Back! Get back!" he barked. The dogs hesitated, panting heavily. John turned to Emma, who was clutching her bleeding arm. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice tight with fear. Emma's face was pale, but she nodded. "It's deep," she admitted, her voice trembling. "But I'm all right." John swallowed hard. He could already see the telltale swelling around the wound. If it was rabies, they didn't have much time. Duke and Rusty took another step forward. The madness hadn't left their eyes. Jack tightened his grip on the plank. "John," he said, his voice grim, "we got a bigger problem than that cow." John's heart pounded. The storm might have passed, but the real danger had only just begun. Chapter 5. Panic and Despair. The rain had stopped, but the world around them felt more chaotic than ever. Emma clutched her injured arm, her breath coming in short gasps. Blood seeped through her fingers, staining the fabric of her sleeve. She stared at Rusty, who stood a few feet away, panting, his mouth still red. John's heart pounded. He had spent years raising those dogs, trusting them, loving them like family. But the way they looked at him now, wild, unpredictable, sick, filled him with a fear he had never known. Jack took a cautious step forward, still gripping the wooden plank like a weapon. "John, get her inside. Now!" Emma shook her head. "No, we still need to." "Emma, you've been bitten," Jack snapped. "We don't know how bad this is. You need to treat it before it gets worse." John swallowed hard. He knew Jack was right. But at the same time, Betty lay trapped beneath the tree, her breathing growing more labored by the second. If they didn't act fast, she wouldn't make it. And the dogs? Duke let out a low growl, his muscles tensed, as if ready to attack again. Rusty paced behind him, his body twitching unnaturally, a desperate containment. "Get them in the pen," Jack muttered. "Lock them up before someone else gets hurt." John nodded. Moving cautiously, he picked up a nearby rope, looping it around his hand. "Duke, come on, boy," he said softly, taking a slow step toward the dog. "Let's get you settled." Duke's eyes flickered. Just for a second, there was something familiar in them. Recognition. A shadow of the loyal companion John had raised since he was a pup. But then it was gone. With a sudden, jerking movement, Duke snapped his teeth at the air and let out a guttural snarl. John's stomach twisted. "He's too far gone." "Move fast," Jack muttered. Together, they corralled the dogs toward the livestock pen. John used the rope to guide them while Jack stood behind, keeping his makeshift weapon ready. The dogs moved, but not because they were obeying. They were stalking, watching, waiting. As soon as they were inside, John slammed the gate shut, locking the latch with shaking hands. The dogs immediately turned on the wooden slats, hurling themselves against the fence, snarling and snapping. Duke's teeth scraped against the wood, and Rusty let out an eerie, warbling growl, pacing in tight, erratic circles. Emma took a trembling step back. "Oh my God, they're not getting better," Jack muttered. "We'll deal with them later. Right now, we gotta get that damn tree off your cow." John turned back to Betty. She was still lying in the mud, her sides barely rising and falling. Her breaths were short and quick, her nostrils flaring with effort. Too much time had passed. She was dying. A race against time. John ran to the winch, his hands fumbling with the jammed mechanism. Come on. Jack climbed back into the truck, revving the engine. "I'll try again." The motor roared, the cable tensed, and for a brief moment, John dared to hope. The branch creaked, shifted slightly, then the winch jammed again. "No!" John slammed his fist against the metal, frustration surging through him like wildfire. Betty let out a weak, strangled sound. Emma was now kneeling beside the cow, whispering softly, "Hold on, girl. Just a little longer." John's chest tightened. This was it. They were losing her. Jack gritted his teeth. Screw the damn winch. He grabbed the axe John had been using earlier, stepping up to the thick branch. "We do this the hard way." John barely had time to react before Jack swung the axe with all his strength. Crack. The blade bit deep. Jack didn't stop. Again. Crack. Again. Crack. Sweat poured down his face. His breaths came in heavy grunts. But with each swing, the wood gave way. John grabbed a crowbar and wedged it beneath the shifting branch. Emma scrambled back, her injured arm clutched to her chest. "Almost there," Jack shouted. One final blow. Snap. The branch gave way, rolling free from Betty's body. For one terrifying second, she didn't move. John dropped to his knees beside her. "Betty?" Emma placed a hand on the cow's side. "She's breathing," she whispered. "But it's shallow." John's hands shook as he stroked Betty's damp coat. She was still alive. Barely. Jack tossed the axe to the side, wiping sweat from his brow. "She's got a chance," he muttered. "But only if we move fast." John met his eyes. The fight wasn't over yet, and neither was the danger. Chapter 6. Hope and Fear. The heavy branch had been lifted, the weight removed, but Betty didn't move. She lay in the mud, her flanks heaving with shallow breaths. Her eyes were half closed, dull, exhausted. John ran a hand along her side, feeling the tremors in her muscles. "Come on, girl," he murmured. "You're free now. Get up." Betty didn't respond. Jack knelt beside him, pressing his fingers gently into the cow's side. "She's weak," he muttered. "Could have been crushed. Might have lost circulation to her legs." John clenched his jaw. The idea of losing Betty after everything was unbearable. "Emma, bring some water," he said without looking up. But Emma didn't respond. Emma's worsening condition. John turned and saw her standing a few feet away, swaying slightly. Her injured arm was clutched tightly to her chest, her face pale. A thin sheen of sweat had formed on her forehead. "Emma?" She blinked at him, unfocused. I don't feel right." John was on his feet in an instant, reaching her just as her knees buckled. He caught her, guiding her down onto a hay bale. "Breathe, he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Tell me what's wrong." "My arm." She pulled her hand away from the wound, revealing the torn, swollen flesh. The skin around the bite had turned an angry red, radiating heat. "It hurts, John. It's getting worse." John swallowed hard. Jack's expression darkened. "You need a doctor. Now." John knew he was right, but the thought of leaving the farm, leaving Betty when she was still struggling, made his stomach twist. As if reading his mind, Jack clapped him on the shoulder. "Go. I'll take care of things here." John hesitated for only a second before nodding. The drive to the hospital. John helped Emma into the truck, her breathing shallow as she leaned against the door. The moment he turned the key, he floored the gas, the truck kicking up mud as it sped down the country road. Emma was quiet, staring at the trees blurring past the window. "You still with me?" John asked, glancing at her. She nodded slowly. "I just can't stop thinking about it." "About what?" She turned to him, her eyes filled with something he rarely saw in her: fear. "What if it's rabies, John?" The question punched the air from his lungs. He gripped the steering wheel tighter, keeping his eyes on the road. "It's not," he said, more to himself than to her. Emma let out a weak laugh. "You don't know that." John didn't respond. He just drove faster. A terrifying diagnosis. By the time they reached the hospital, Emma was struggling to stay upright. A nurse helped her into a wheelchair while John rushed alongside her, his heart hammering in his chest. A doctor arrived within minutes, his face growing more serious as he examined the bite. He pressed gently against the swollen skin, causing Emma to wince. "How long ago did this happen?" he asked. "Maybe an hour," John said. The doctor nodded grimly. "You were attacked by a dog?" Emma hesitated before nodding. The doctor exhaled sharply. "We need to act fast." John felt his stomach drop. "What do you mean?" The doctor looked directly at Emma. "Rabies is a possibility. If the dog was infected, the virus is already in your system. We need to start post-exposure treatment immediately." Emma's fingers tightened around John's hand. "And if we don't?" The doctor's gaze didn't waver. "Once symptoms appear, there's nothing we can do." Silence. John felt like the room had shrunk, the walls pressing in. Emma's breathing hitched, and for the first time, true panic flickered in her eyes. "What do we do?" she whispered. The doctor's answer was immediate. "We give you the first dose of the rabies vaccine right now, and we pray that we caught it in time." Chapter 7. Difficult Decisions. The truck rumbled down the familiar dirt road, but for the first time in years, John felt like a stranger on his own land. The weight of the night's events pressed down on him. Emma's bite, the doctor's grim words, and now, the dogs. Duke and Rusty weren't just pets. They were family, loyal companions who had guarded the farm for years. And now, they were locked in the pen, snarling and snapping like wild beasts. John gripped the wheel tighter as he pulled up to the house. Jack was waiting for him on the porch, arms crossed, face grim. The moment John stepped out of the truck, Jack spoke. "They're worse." John didn't need to ask who. A grim update. Jack led John toward the pen, his boots crunching over damp gravel. The farm felt eerily still. Betty lay resting near the barn, too weak to move much, the other animals quiet, sensing something was wrong. As they neared the pen, John's stomach twisted. Duke and Rusty were pacing in frantic circles, their heads low, eyes darting wildly. Their fur was slick with sweat, their ribs rising and falling in uneven breaths. Rusty foamed at the mouth, thick strands of saliva dripping from his open jaws. And then there was the sound, a deep, unnatural growl that seemed to come from somewhere far beyond them, something that no longer belonged to the loyal dogs John had raised. Jack sighed. "They haven't stopped since you left. Won't eat, won't drink, just pacing." John swallowed hard. "Did they try to attack?" Jack nodded. "Tried to climb the fence at one point. I had to reinforce it. They're not thinking straight anymore, John." John ran a hand down his face. "Damn it." Jack placed a firm hand on his shoulder. "I called the vet." John turned sharply. "Already? You know what this is," Jack said quietly. "And so do I." John wanted to argue, wanted to say that maybe there was still time. Maybe the vet would have another option. But deep down, he knew Jack was right, and it made him sick. The vet's confirmation. The veterinarian arrived within the hour, an older woman named Dr. Perkins who had been tending to the town's animals for as long as John could remember. She didn't waste time. With careful, practiced movements, she approached the pen, observing the dogs. Duke lunged at the fence the moment she got close, snapping at the air, his eyes wild. Rusty circled behind him, his movements jerky, uncoordinated. Dr. Perkins sighed. "It's exactly what you think it is." John felt his breath hitch. "You're sure?" She nodded. "Advanced stage rabies. The aggression, the pacing, the foaming. It's all there. They're suffering, John." John felt his throat tighten. He had known it, but hearing it aloud made it real in a way he wasn't prepared for. Jack cleared his throat. "There's no way back from this, is there?" Dr. Perkins shook her head. "No, the virus has taken hold. There's nothing I can do to save them." Silence stretched between them, heavy and unbearable. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, John asked the question he had been dreading. "What do we do?" Dr. Perkins met his gaze, sympathy in her eyes. "We put them down." The words hit like a punch to the gut. John took a step back, rubbing a hand over his face. His chest felt tight, his stomach twisted in knots. These were his boys, the same dogs who had chased rabbits through the fields, who had curled up on the porch beside him after long days of work. The same dogs who had guarded Emma when she walked through the woods, who had slept at the foot of their bed during thunderstorms. And now he had to say goodbye, the hardest choice. Dr. Perkins spoke gently. "I know this is hard, John, but they're suffering. And if they break out of that pen, someone else could get hurt." John thought of Emma, lying in a hospital bed, terrified that she might not make it. He clenched his jaw. "Do it." Dr. Perkins gave a solemn nod and went to retrieve her supplies. Jack stayed by John's side, offering silent support. He knew there was nothing to say that could make this easier. John watched as the vet prepared the syringes, his hands clenched into fists. A few minutes later, it was done. The snarling stopped, the pacing stopped, and the farm fell silent once more. Emma's understanding. That night, John sat on the porch, staring out at the darkened fields. Jack had gone home, and the world felt unbearably empty. His boys were gone. Betty was still weak. And Emma, his phone buzzed beside him. He hesitated before picking it up. A text from Emma, "Are you home?" He exhaled slowly before typing back, "Yeah." A moment later, another message came through. "Did you do it?" John hesitated before replying. "Yeah." Pause. Then, "I'm so sorry." John swallowed hard. "Me too." He leaned back against the chair, closing his eyes. It was the right choice, but that didn't make it any easier. Chapter 8. Farewell and New Care. The morning air was thick with the scent of damp earth, the sky still overcast from last night's storm. John stood in the yard, his boots rooted to the muddy ground as he watched the empty pen where Duke and Rusty had once paced. The silence seemed unbearable now. Emma stood beside him, her hand resting lightly on his arm. She, too, was staring at the pen, her expression distant. Neither of them spoke, the weight of what they had done still hanging in the air between them. They had said their goodbyes in the quiet of the barn earlier that morning. John had held Duke's head in his hands, stroking the dog's familiar coat for the last time. Emma had done the same with Rusty, whispering words of comfort to a dog that had once been her protector. But no words could undo the finality of their actions. "You think we did the right thing?" Emma's voice was soft, barely above a whisper. John turned to her, his heart heavy. "I don't know, but they weren't the dogs we knew anymore, Em." She nodded, her eyes filled with unshed tears. "I know, but they were still ours." "Yeah," he replied, his voice rough. "They were." Betty's slow recovery. As the days passed, Betty's condition slowly improved. She had not gotten up the day after the accident, but by the third day, she was standing, albeit shakily. John had been by her side constantly, bringing her fresh water and hay, doing everything he could to help her regain her strength. Emma, too, spent time with Betty, brushing her down, talking to her softly. They were both relieved to see the cow's appetite return, even if it was just a little at a time. Her steps were still slow, and she stumbled often, but she was fighting just like they were. "We're going to get through this," Emma said one afternoon as she watched Betty graze in the small field behind the barn. John stood beside her, his arms crossed. "We've got to, Jack's help." The storm had done more than just damage the barn. It had left the farm in a state of disarray. The roof had caved in partially, and a few walls were severely cracked. With Betty recovering, John knew they had to fix things fast if they wanted to keep the animals comfortable and safe. Jack had been a godsend. He spent most of his days helping John clear the wreckage and rebuild. They worked long hours together, hammering, nailing, and patching up the damage. John appreciated Jack's presence, even if the work was hard. Having someone to talk to made the days more bearable. "We'll get it back to how it was," Jack said one afternoon, wiping sweat from his brow as they lifted a new section of roofing into place. "Don't you worry about that." John nodded, grateful for his friend's strength. It was hard not to feel worn out after everything they had been through. But Jack's words were a reminder that the work would eventually pay off. A visit from the vet. A few days after the barn repairs were underway, Dr. Perkins stopped by the farm to check on the other animals. She had heard about the rabies incident and wanted to make sure there was no further threat to the farm. John and Emma led her around, showing her the pigs, the ducks, the chickens, and the 2 remaining cows. Emma kept a watchful eye on the animals, her protective instinct kicking in as she made sure they were all behaving normally. Dr. Perkins smiled as she examined each animal, checking their vital signs and looking for signs of illness. "They all seem healthy," she said after a thorough inspection. "No signs of rabies or any other diseases. You've done a good job keeping them well." John let out a long breath. "That's a relief." "Don't worry," the vet continued, "your farm is in good shape. With Betty's recovery, things should be back to normal soon." A quiet moment of relief. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm orange glow over the farm, John and Emma sat on the porch, their tired bodies sinking into the worn wooden chairs. The smell of fresh hay and the sounds of content animals filled the air, and for the first time in days, they both allowed themselves to relax. Betty was resting in the field nearby, chewing on the fresh grass. The ducks were swimming lazily in their pond, and the pigs were rooting around in the mud. It was a peaceful, almost idyllic scene, and for a moment, John allowed himself to forget the challenges they had faced. Emma leaned her head against his shoulder. "We made it through, didn't we?" John wrapped his arm around her, pulling her closer. "We did. We're still here." The silence between them was no longer heavy with fear or grief. It was a quiet peace, a moment of understanding that they had endured the storm and were slowly healing. "We'll keep going," John said softly. "We've got this." Emma smiled up at him, her eyes tired but filled with gratitude. Yeah, we do. As the stars began to twinkle above them, John felt a deep sense of relief wash over him. They had faced the worst, and though the road ahead would not always be easy, they had each other, and that was enough. They had survived, and together they would rebuild. Chapter 9. Light at the end of the tunnel. The last needle slid into Emma's arm with a soft click. Her muscles tensed for a moment, the sharp sting of the injection causing her to wince. But as the needle was withdrawn, she let out a long breath, and for the first time in days, the weight of her fear seemed to lift. "That's the last one," Dr. Perkins said, packing her equipment with practiced hands. "You're in the clear now, Emma. No signs of infection or rabies. You're safe." Emma let out a quiet, relieved laugh, leaning back in the chair. "Thank goodness," she murmured, rubbing her sore arm. John stood beside her, his hand resting on her shoulder. He'd been waiting anxiously the whole time, and now, with the news that Emma had made it through unscathed, he could finally exhale. Dr. Perkins gave Emma a reassuring smile before turning to John. "Just keep an eye on her for a few days. She should be fine. The worst is over now." "Thank you, Dr. Perkins," John said, his voice thick with gratitude. With a final nod, the vet left, and for the first time in what felt like forever, John and Emma were alone, their hearts finally beginning to heal. Life on the farm returns. Back at the farm, life slowly began to settle into its old rhythm. The repairs to the barn were nearly finished, and with Jack's help, John had managed to make sure that the animals' homes were safe and secure once again. The pigs were happily rooting through the dirt, the chickens pecking at the ground, and the ducks paddling in the pond. Even Betty was improving, walking more confidently each day, her strength returning bit by bit. John and Emma found themselves spending quiet afternoons together, working side by side. Emma would feed the animals, talk to the chickens, and check on the cows, while John worked on small repairs or mended the fences. There was a sense of contentment between them. Simple tasks that were once mundane now felt like moments of peace, and the days stretched out before them, full of quiet hope. They had weathered the worst of the storm, and now, it seemed, they could finally take a breath. A new friend. One bright afternoon, as John was finishing a small project in the barn, he heard the sound of tires crunching on the gravel driveway. He looked up to see Jack's truck pulling up to the house, and he waved as his friend stepped out. "I've got something for you," Jack called with a grin as he approached. John raised an eyebrow. "What's that?" Jack didn't answer right away. Instead, he pulled something small and squirming from the back of the truck. "This little guy," Jack said, kneeling to reveal a small, scruffy puppy. A new member of the family, the puppy was a fluffy ball of fur, with ears that flopped over his eyes and paws that were too big for his body. His tail wagged furiously as he bounded over to John, tumbling at his feet. John laughed and bent down to pick him up. "A puppy? For the farm?" Jack nodded, his eyes twinkling. "Yep, I figured you could use a little joy around here. Besides, he's already a natural with the animals." John looked at the puppy, who was licking his face with an eager, wiggly enthusiasm. He felt a smile spread across his face. Maybe this was just what they needed. "Well, I can't say no to that," John said, hugging the puppy close. "Thank you, Jack." Jack grinned. "He's yours now. Name him whatever you want." They watched the puppy, who was already chasing his own tail in circles. It felt like a new chapter, one filled with laughter and a renewed sense of hope, planting a new tree. Later that afternoon, John found himself standing at the edge of the property, looking at the place where the old tree had once stood, the one that had fallen during the storm, the one that had been a fixture on the farm for as long as he could remember. He had been putting it off, but now, standing in the fading light of the day, he felt it was time. Time to plant something new. John had already dug the hole. He paused for a moment, staring at the empty space. The storm had taken so much, Duke and Rusty, the old tree. But now, in this quiet moment, he knew that life had a way of coming back. He placed the young sapling into the hole, gently patting the soil around its roots. The tree was small, but it was strong. A new beginning. "Here's to new growth," he murmured, stepping back to admire the tree. His hands dirted but his heart lighter. Emma joined him, standing beside him in silence. She looked down at the sapling and then up at John. "You think it'll grow strong?" she asked. John nodded, a smile tugging at his lips. "It has to." A quiet evening. That night, after a long day of work, John and Emma sat on the porch again, their tired bodies leaning back in their chairs. The soft glow of the setting sun bathed the farm in golden light, and a quiet calm had settled over everything. The tea was steeping on the table beside them, the warm scent filling the air. The fire crackled in the stone fireplace, casting gentle flickers of light across the porch. It was one of those rare moments when the world felt still, when nothing needed to be fixed or repaired, when everything was right. John looked over at Emma, her face soft with exhaustion and peace. He could see the quiet relief in her eyes. She had come so far, both of them had, and now, for the first time in a long while, there was no pressing worry hanging over them. "We made it," Emma said softly, her voice carrying a note of contentment. John smiled, his eyes closing for a moment as he soaked in the peaceful evening. "Yeah, we did." And for the first time in what felt like forever, John allowed himself to relax. To truly relax. They had endured the storm. They had lost so much, but they had also gained something precious, a new sense of resilience. And as the stars twinkled above them, he knew that whatever came next, they would face it together. With a sigh of contentment, John raised his mug of tea to Emma, offering a quiet toast. "To new beginnings," he said. "To new beginnings," Emma echoed, clinking her mug against his. And in that moment, as the warmth of the fire and the stars wrapped around them, John felt that, for the first time in a long time, everything was as it should be. Chapter 10, Time to Move On. The morning sun filtered gently through the trees, casting a soft golden light over the farm. It was a quiet, peaceful morning, a stark contrast to the stormy chaos that had consumed their lives not long ago. The air was crisp and clean, and the earth seemed to have sighed in relief after the heavy rain. All around the farm, the animals were content, their bellies full and their spirits high. The pigs rooted happily in their pen, the ducks waddled along the edge of the pond, and the chickens clucked busily at the feeders. It was as though nothing had changed, as though the horrors of the past few weeks had never happened at all. But for John and Emma, the calm felt earned. Every sound, every moment of peace was a reminder that they had fought through the worst and had made it to the other side. John stood at the window, sipping his coffee and watching the morning unfold. He felt a deep sense of gratitude in his chest. For the first time in what felt like forever, there was no looming threat, no sense of danger. As he looked out across the fields, he saw Emma in the barn, checking on Betty. The cow, now stronger and steadier, had been getting up and moving around more freely each day. Her recovery had been slow, but it was steady, and every small improvement filled Emma's heart with a joy she hadn't known in weeks. "Betty stands." John stepped outside and made his way toward the barn, his footsteps slow and deliberate. He paused at the door, watching as Emma gently patted Betty's back, murmuring soothing words to her. The cow's movements were still cautious, but there was a strength in her eyes, a determination that had been absent when she had first been freed from the fallen tree. "Look at her," Emma said, her voice thick with emotion. She looked up at John, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. "She's standing. She's really standing." John smiled softly, his heart swelling with pride. He had watched over Betty every day, helping her take her first steps back to health. But seeing her on her own feet now, standing strong once more, was a victory neither of them would ever forget. "She's a fighter," he said quietly, walking over to Emma and resting a hand on her shoulder. "Just like us." Emma wiped a tear from her cheek, smiling through it. "Yeah," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Just like us." A new puppy on the farm. Later that day, as the sun climbed higher in the sky, John found himself in the yard, the new puppy at his feet. The little dog had already made himself at home on the farm, bounding from one spot to the next, his ears flopping with every step. John bent down to attach the leash, intending to take the puppy on his first walk. The puppy wagged his tail furiously, clearly excited by the prospect of an adventure. John opened the gate and watched as the puppy dashed off, racing toward the open field where the geese were grazing. The geese honked in surprise as the tiny puppy trotted up to them, sniffing curiously at their feathers. To John's delight, the geese didn't seem too upset by the newcomer's enthusiasm. Instead, they simply honked loudly and waddled away, allowing the puppy to chase after them in joyful circles. Emma laughed from the porch, watching the playful scene unfold. "Looks like he's made friends already." John chuckled and leaned on the fence. "He's a good one. He'll be a great farm dog." The puppy looked up at him, his eyes bright and full of mischief. John felt a warmth spread through him as he watched the little dog play. It felt like a sign of hope, a fresh start, moving beyond the past. As the days passed, the scars of the past began to fade. The wreckage from the storm had been cleared away, and the animals had all returned to their routines. Betty, stronger each day, now moved with confidence, her dark eyes calm and content. The rest of the animals were happy and healthy, and the farm, though still recovering from the damage, had returned to its familiar rhythm. For Emma and John, the past few weeks had been a blur of emotion: fear, loss, and, at times, despair. But now, looking around the farm at the life that was beginning to flourish again, they both knew that the worst was behind them. The tragedies they had endured were now only memories. Painful, yes, but far in the past. They had overcome the storm, had faced the dangers that had threatened them, and had come out stronger for it. "Do you think we'll ever forget?" Emma asked one evening as they sat on the porch, the sun dipping below the horizon in a fiery burst of color. John leaned back in his chair, his hands resting on his lap. "I don't think we should forget," he replied, "but we can move forward. We've earned that." Emma nodded, the corners of her lips turning up in a small, satisfied smile. "Yeah, we have." A quiet, grateful silence. As the stars began to twinkle in the night sky, Emma and John sat in silence, their chairs rocking gently on the porch. The farm around them was quiet, save for the soft rustling of the wind through the trees and the occasional contented grunt from the animals. The new puppy had finally settled down for a nap beside them, his tiny body curled up in a ball of fur. The fire in the hearth crackled softly, casting a warm glow on their faces. Everything felt right. For the first time in what seemed like forever, John felt a deep sense of peace wash over him. It was as if the storm, the fear, and the pain had been erased, leaving only the simple, quiet life. Emma looked at him, her face relaxed and content, her hand resting in his. "Thank you," she said softly, "for everything." John squeezed her hand gently, his voice filled with quiet gratitude. "We did it together." The soft glow of the fire, the sounds of the farm, and the peaceful silence enveloped them. Life had moved on, and as the stars gleamed brightly overhead, John and Emma knew that whatever the future held, they would face it together. And so, life on the farm continued, one step at a time, one day at a time, with love, strength, and the quiet assurance that no matter what came their way, they would endure.